welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am so excited to be having the conversation we're about to have. I am joined by the author of a book that I know already is going to be one of my favorites of the year, and I am so excited. So, welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. My name is Blair Fell, and my new novel coming out is Disco Witches of Fire Island.
When the arc came to me in the mail, I literally gasped. Like, the cover is so beautiful, the title is so perfect. But before we get too much into the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your career? Maybe a little bit about your first novel as well.
Okay, well, I actually came to writing novels fairly late in the game of my life. I had started writing when I was about 29, and I worked on plays to begin with. So I wrote a lot of downtown New York City plays that were done in bars, and then eventually regional theaters, and then some actually went international. And then from there, I moved to television, and I worked a little bit in television, as well as writing. Awards show speeches for celebrities. That was something I also did, and a bit of web writing. And I've also written essays and stuff. But then when I left television and moved back to New York, I wasn't sure where I was going to write. I didn't want to write plays anymore because I really love like working alone, but I had never ever considered writing novels. But kind of late in life, I'm like, I'm gonna go get my MFA. I'm gonna, putz around with other kind of writing, and maybe I'll be a creative fiction writer or something like that. I like writing essays. But then I had an idea for a play, but when I started writing it, I'm like, this isn't a play. It seems to be a novel, which I don't know how to write. So, but whatever, I'll put one word after another. Got into this amazing writing group. We meet every week. And in my MFA and in the writing group, I ended up writing this first novel, which is called The Sign for Home, which is about a straight, deaf, blind Jehovah's Witness and his gay interpreter and their friendship. And there's also a love story because they go on this journey to find the girl that got away for the deaf, blind guy. I'm also a sign language interpreter, so for the last 30 years, on top of all of the writing. And I ended up selling that or getting an agent and selling that right as I was graduating my MFA in 2020 in the middle of COVID. And also at that time, I started writing this. Uh, a funny story about both of these novels is I never expected to get published. I had an idyllic beginning to my publishing journey in the sense it was the first agent I contacted, and he sold it the first novel at auction in the middle of, COVID. But when I was writing these two books, the backstory of both of them, which is based in my life, I used kind of the same backstory for two of the main characters or in each of the books, not thinking anything would ever be published. And now they're both published and they both have the same backstory. As for and backstory, I mean, the main character in Disco Witches is a character named Joe Agabian, who's this Armenian American guy. Not Armenian American in the first book, but they both have this tragedy in their background, which is the death of their first lover, which is based in my own life, which happened to me in the middle of the AIDS crisis when I was in my early 20s. The first man I fell in love with was HIV positive. I'm HIV negative. And we lived together and he dumped me because I just couldn't handle my emotions dealing with the fact of our zero discordance, meaning, his positive, me being negative. I was madly in love with him, but he couldn't take it, dumped me, and then never talked to me again for 2 years and then died. And that's the backstory of where the novel begins in Disco Witches of Fire Island. But a similar backstories in the first novel, although the his lover had cancer. When I realized that my first novel was going to be published, I changed that in the second one. But it's the same kind of where do you go from this heartbreak? How do you love again? How do you get over that? How do you turn your despair into action? And which is very much what the second book is about.
Yeah, it's really touching, and I'd love to talk more about Joe, um, and what brings him to Fire Island, in 1989. In addition to the parts of his backstory that he shares with you, I feel like he really presents a really moving like snapshot of time, both in a particular like time period and in a particular place, and a fascinating window on on 20th century LGBT history. So could you talk a little bit more about shaping him and the beginning of his journey in this story?
Absolutely. That's a good question. Uh, the truth is, a lot of him is based on me. It's not autofiction, but it's pretty close in certain ways. When I was 29, as I said, that was when I discovered my first partner had died. I was actually working for a New York City council member at the time. Kind of flipped out, got fired from my job for telling off a nun about condom distribution. And luckily, she let me stay on unemployment, not the nun, my boss, a city council member. And I went on this journey to China, actually. It was just kind of a whirlwind last minute thing. And it was there I decided to become a writer. When I got back from that journey, I decided, well, I want to take some time to write. I hear I can get a job on Fire Island. And so, sight unseen, I had never visited Fire Island before. I don't even know if had ever really been in Long Island before. And I got on a train, went out there, landed this job as a bartender, and ended up getting housing in the attic of these three older gay men. That's like based and true, which is the setup for the book. Um, and one of them, a guy named Frank Cordino, uh, he's he's a character. He's like this 6'3" flamboyant guy that would make these huge lit up hats and go dancing at 4 in the morning. The other housemate was this little Italian guy whose name was Jerry. And Jerry was always like in the bushes and in the meat rack and stuff like that, and always like, saying these salacious things. And they had this banter back and forth that was hysterical. And they would be cooking illicit substances on the stove. And I'm in their attic at like, this 20, and this is something that's in the book. I was 29, but telling everyone I was 24. And and I was just, you know, brand new to Fire Island. I was a bartender, and they were these older guys, so they were just like thrilled that they had this like young, like hot piece of fresh meat living in their attic. And anyway, they kind of eventually, in my mind, became these disco witches, and that's where that idea came from. With this book and how you said about it being a snapshot. This, by the way, was in the early 90s. The book is set in 89. Like when I just shortly after I had just moved to New York at that time and got involved in AIDS activism, kind of after having that great loss in my life and feeling so hopeless, as many gay men felt in that time. I was at a gay pride parade and I saw ACT UP marching. It was the first time I'd ever seen them. ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was a huge force then, and actually is kind of participating in a lot of activism now. They kind of Many of the members did an offshoot and became an organization now called Rise and Resist, which is fighting some of the awful things that are happening now, which are some of the things we fought and won for that are now being dismantled by the current administration. But anyway, I joined ACT UP, went to like some of the demonstrations that would eventually lead to this life-saving medications that are out there today, which are also something that might be defunded by this administration, which is just so stupid. But anyway, so I wanted to give with this novel, I wanted to, besides kind of getting a snapshot of my own life, getting a snapshot of what it was to be a young gay man at that time, trying to find love when perhaps this man that you fall in love with will either infect you or worse, in my opinion, die on you, which had happened to me already. And how do you find love that way when that and it was just such for me as a young gay man, so tormenting, but it was the center of my life. Every other thought in my brain was, is this person I love going to die? Am I going to be infected? So I wanted to kind of give a glimpse into that for younger people that don't know what it was like, but also to write a love story, a romance, set on the island, because I'm a huge romance fan. I mean, rom-coms especially. Uh, I love those. Uh, but I wanted to set it in that time because I did fall in love again. Um, many times. But after that experience, and I was able to, but always, even to this day, there's still that wrestling with the fear of whatever lover I have, their mortality. That kind of was ingrained into me, that loss when you suffer it at such a young age. But yeah, and I wanted to capture the magic of that island the way I experienced it. Fire Island for me, I'm more of a Provincetown guy actually these days because I like to bike and do other things. But that summer was so magical with those older men that I lived with because like in the book, they would play disco, 70s disco 24/7. It would just be boom, 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 boom on the speakers in the living room because they each went out at different times of the night, but like a couple of them would be going out 4 in the morning. And again, they were in I think they were 50s. They might have been in their 40s, whatever. To me, they were ancient, at the time, but they were older and they were going out in these wee hours of the night, and where I was a bartender, I was coming home around 5 in the morning because that's how bars work. You finish at 4, and then you have to clean up and then you go back. Uh, but yeah, so I wanted to capture kind of all of that, in this novel and make it fun too.
Well, absolutely. I am really glad that you brought up the aspect of the intergenerational relationships because I feel like it's a really important theme, in addition to just supplying these three amazing characters, Howie, Lenny, and Max, who I just, wonderful. I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about like the role of intergenerational relationships because I feel like what we see happening with their characters is there's like a lot of mentorship and like also found family or chosen family type stuff, but also like sort of like intergenerational conflict the way that we normally think about it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. That was a very important thing for me. I will say, the guys that were really in my life, those particular guys, not so much mentors, more bad examples in a lot of ways, for the way they were living their lives, which I adopted later. But there's an importance of that. It was something that we lost as young gay men, since so many people of that age were dying. In fact, one of the three that I lived with, who I was less close to, he ended up dying. You know, due to the crisis, not exactly as a direct result of the disease he had. He was HIV positive, but mental health reasons because of that. The other two, one passed away just a few years ago from a heart attack. The guy that would become Lenny, who's described as a man with a heart of gold with a stent. He had heart problems, but the guy that is Howie is still alive and kicking, and helped me out in like certain questions I had about that period in this book. But I did have mentors in my life, a few of them, but I wanted more. So this was almost like wish fulfillment that I had people to help me through that heartbreak I was going through. There were other people that would come into my life, but I know in my own life with younger gay men, I try to be there for them in that way. As far as the conflict goes, there always is this conflict. In the gay world, there's a lot of intergenerational mixing. There's a lot of intergenerational relationships just because it's just so funny. I always talk about, when you're young, this is your audience who you will date. And then there'll be these guys that are really super handsome, and you're like, why aren't they looking at me? And then you hit an older age, your 40s or your 50s, and suddenly these guys in their 30s or 40s or 50s that are super hot that never paid attention to you before will suddenly be all into you. And also guys in their 20s, you're like, what's going on? And it's just something that happens as far as attraction in the gay world. Everyone has their niche. It's kind of a great thing. Probably in the straight world it happens too, but for every prejudice, there's a niche of desire in the gay world. So you always can find your niche. It's a really nice thing. Just make sure. And I think Lenny talks about this, or he did at one point, is like make sure you get it to the right market. Like, I think that's still in the book where Lenny talks about how when he was young, he wanted to be this chicken, this spring chicken, but his hair was falling out, he was getting fat, and then he realized to kind of surrender to what was and embrace who he was. And then he found this whole new market of desire and became more in love with who he was rather than holding on to the youthful aspect. And that's something I wanted to express in the book. There's all these rules and stuff for being young and gay, but there's also all these other ways of being as you get older that one needs to embrace. As you read at the beginning of every chapter, there's the Disco Witch Manifesto. And the Disco Witch Manifesto, which is allegedly this manifesto kind of religious text of the disco witches, has guidance to that about when you get older and how to embrace that, as well as just other general rules for how to be in the world as a holy lover, which is anyone who's other or queer. And then there's the Disco Witches, and both those kind of suggestions are laid out in the Disco Witch Manifesto.
I love the manifesto. I really love how the quotes are themed to the chapters so beautifully. And like I was in my head dreaming of like a little like gift book, of the manifesto itself with the quotes, like of the kind that you would pick up like at the register at Borders back in the day, like, oh.
Love that. Love that. It was actually funny. I came upon the idea for the manifesto because my husband at the time, who's still one of my best friends, um, introduced me to a book called Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions. And this was a book from the 1970s, which these like kind of radical fairy type gay men put together, which was it was also lesbians, gay men, trans people were kind of created this manifesto, this text with illustrations that had these like amazing, crazy quotes in there. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool to have something like this. And then I'm like, aha, yeah, I want my Disco Witch Coven to have something like this. The Disco Witch Manifesto has a little bit more sensible advice. That Faggots and the Friends Between Revolutions is a little bit more radical, crazy thing, but they do have an overlap about talking about the overlords. Kind of, I'm not sure if they use that language, but I use that language, which means the hegemonic forces of, hetero world that we're guided by, and where yes, we welcome allies, but if you screw with us, we're going to fight back, which is a theme in the book.
Mhm. Yeah, I would love to talk more about that too. Perhaps some of the conflicts and antagonists. There are antagonists, large and small, I feel like, from the Great Darkness, which is referenced forebodingly, but also like a little bit more down to earth, like Scotty. There are. So could you talk a little bit about like the various the antagonists of this novel?
Well, I think the most important antagonist is the Great Darkness, which slight before we started talking today, you and I were talking about the resonance it has with this moment in time, because queer people are being like immigrants, like women, like the disabled, and I am connected to all of these groups are suffering greatly under the current administration, which, in my opinion, is part of the Great Darkness. And at the time of the book's writing, the Great Darkness was there. And the Great Darkness is the thing that created AIDS, that created the hatred for people with AIDS, that creates hatred for people with disabilities, for women, for anyone who's queer. It's that hatred. I give a description of it in the book is, it's about hatred. It's like the rancidness in your wine. It's all that is dark and hurts the great balance. The great balance is this thing where, love and sex and joy reign. And it's the world is constantly in this fight between the great balance and the great darkness. And the great darkness is the thing that feeds Scotty Black, which is the owner of all the things in the harbor in Fire Island, who in a way has a direct connection with the Great Darkness. The Great Darkness creates, the other forces in the thing, but it's also the thing that creates people's hatred for people that are different than them. And that's, as we said, the book really speaks to today because it's like, what do you do? How do you fight the great darkness? And the way to do that is, with love, with creating art, with dancing. That's, how the witches fight it. And that's how I believe we need to fight it, is with creating things, creating works of art, getting out there and protesting, sitting back and letting this oppression just make us suffer is not the answer. Just even spiritually, and that's what I learned when I was younger about getting involved with ACT UP. It You get the rage, which has its own like, oh, that's hard to deal with sometimes, but you're doing something. Getting into action is always the solution, in my opinion. And the character, that's his journey in the book, is learning that, which he learns from the Disco Witches, who, were there at Stonewall, were there at all these other moments of great transformation, positive transformation of the country. And yeah, so I think it definitely speaks to today. The There were other antagonists actually earlier in the drafts. I actually cut a lot out of the draft. Like Elena, who was a character I actually loved very much. She was actually a whole third of the book because there was her point of view, but the book was really long. I'm always a very long writer. My first novel was 800 pages before it was cut to 400. So I had to cut literally half a book. I just like to like go deep, I guess. Um, but I love that character. She had her own antagonist who's now just kind of mentioned in passing in the past. But they're the two main. We won't talk about Gladiator Man. I don't want to give anything away. He's this totally unbelievably hot guy that Joe sees when he first gets off the ferry and lands there, and that becomes a whole thing. You'll need to read the book to find out what he's about. And then, of course, there's Joe's love interest, who's not an antagonist, but is a pretty hot guy himself. Um, just a funny thing. So I pull, as I said, a ton from my life, especially names. And so the name of one of the main love interests is Fergal the ferryman, who's this totally hot deckhand on the ferry, who's named for this guy I briefly dated in London when I was in my early 30s. Um, and I haven't really stayed that much in contact with him, but I love the name. So I just like threw that on this guy. Uh, there's Saint de Norman, who's one of the other disco witches. I love him. He's actually based on this, I could cry talking about him. He's this amazing guy in Los Angeles named Don Norman, who passed away. He was in his 70s, late 70s. I'm actually not sure how old he was when he died, but he was this holy man that I would see all the time, and it was always just so, he was a mentor of so many people and so loving. But I mean, I just like basically pulled his soul and just put it into that character. Dory, um, who's mixed race octogenarian, which one of the female witches in the book, she's based on one of the owners of the bar I worked at, who was an octogenarian white woman. But I didn't want to base it just totally on her. But she would tell me her name was Doris Tausig, and again, the character Dory Lieberman de Lagrange is different than Dory Tausig. But there's certain things. They drink the same drink. Dory would sit in the bar and regale me of stories about how she loved leather men because she thought they were just all so gentle and sweet and all loved opera. She would just be telling me, and her father indeed was a bootlegger in on Fire Island, and that's how they ended up getting land on Fire Island. So I kind of pinched that from her backstory, but that's fictional character otherwise. Uh, yeah, I mean Scotty Black isn't really based on anyone specifically. There was a guy at the time that just owned a lot of stuff in the harbor, and we would have to take these really long, circuitous journeys to get beer into the bar because he wouldn't let us get to the nearer dock. And I thought it was a dick move. So I made a character. No, it's not. It's really not him. It's a fictional, awful character. It's not based on anyone really. Yeah, and then just like other little things there. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the Great Darkness is really the main force of evil in the book and in our world.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I really love like in response to that, the sort of that interplay between magic and dance and music and resistance. Like it's all so complex and beautiful. And when you think about like magic as like curated intention, like that is resistance, that is like putting the energy that you want to see into the world. So,
Yes, yes, definitely. Definitely. I mean, it was, I mean, for me, resistance was just so magical. For me, I mean, it saved my life. I was just so helpless, and despondent at that time. And it was without a doubt magic. And indeed, it eventually led to something that kept people alive. And I do believe, I mean, resistance is our only path right now at the moment in the world we're living in today. But also back then, it was all we had. Otherwise, it was just gossip and negativity and despair. I remember going on a date with someone just like once, like back in my 20s, and the guy saying, well, what's the point? We're all going to die, be infected and die anyway. And that was a lot of people's thoughts because, again, which I kind of point out in the book, at that time, if you had HIV, it meant you were going to die in 1989. The only hope was like, am I going to be able to wait long enough before I get the opportunistic infections that maybe a miracle will happen or a drug will be discovered, but right now there's nothing um, that will keep me alive. And yeah, and the resistance led to something that is keeping people who are HIV positive alive. Um, I mean, one of the most, again, not to dwell on this because we want to talk about my book, but one of the horrific things that this Trump administration did in canceling US aid was immediately stopping all the medicine to these countries we had committed the medicine to. And so that hundreds and hundreds of infants were born with HIV that wouldn't have been if that medicine had gotten to them. A 10-year-old literally died because his medicine was stopped because of what Trump did. So, anyway, I'm very emotional about that. Sorry about that.
yeah, no, and I think it's an important reminder, and it is, a really essential moment, I think, for this book to be coming out and putting, that sort of energy of resistance and, ultimately radical joy, I think, too, into the world.
Yes.
So,
Yes, thanks for mentioning that. The book is a romance. It's not all
yeah.
just the star stuff. It is a love story. It's a romance. It has an ending that will make you feel extremely satisfied. Not giving what it away, but yeah, I think you'll like it. It is, yeah, I love romances and I wanted romance to be at the heart of it. My first book, that even though it was marketed as romance, was really a coming of age story and a love story in there, but more of a friendship story. But I wanted to write a romance because I love them because I'm always looking for love, It's like my favorite pastime. It's what I do to relax. And yes, there's a lot of joy, and not only joy about like in terms of discovering that one can love again after such a heartbreak. But it's also the joy of finding family and finding, oh, these people, finding Howie, Lenny, Max, St. Norman, Dory, Elena, all these friendships. And of course, Ronnie, who's also one of my favorite characters, which is Joe's best friend going into it. He's the guy that convinces Joe and lies to him to get him to go to Fire Island, but has his own secrets that are surprising in the book. And it's very much about how finding our true selves, finding that found family is our salvation, which is another thing I think we need for this moment in time, very much so.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, we're in a moment, I think, that wants us to stay isolated, and the best way to resist that is community. And I think this novel is like a really, among all the other things we've discussed, like a really beautiful celebration of community. So thank you so much for coming to our community and talking about it with me.
Thank you for having me. This has been really wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And listeners, it's time for you to check out Disco Witches of Fire Island. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for your books. It will be there waiting for you. All right, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.